Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing dialogue and inquiry into origins and evolutions of American systems of government. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's program here at the Virtual Center. I am Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to be with you on this beautiful Monday in the middle of September. Well, not quite the middle, but close enough. I think today is the 9th of September. It is a pleasure to be with you. I always get a little bit excited on Monday because I know that we haven't been together since the previous Wednesday. So a lot happens, and I pile up my literature here, and in a few moments of conversation before we went on the air, I was telling Bob Kincaid that, sometimes I'm not sure where we're going to go. We usually end up somewhere, but it is a pleasure to be with you today, and I welcome you to the program, and I thank you for your willingness to give us some of your very valuable time. And I know that there's so many different ways that you could spend that time, and there are so many different people competing for your time and for your attention that I really respect your willingness to give us at least a moment or two of that time. And again, I realize that you can turn the channel so easily, and I appreciate that. And I hope that we can make your time with us valuable and worthwhile and something that will cause you to come back and visit again. I also invite you to tune in the evening for Bob Kincaid's program here on the Horn on the Head On Radio Network. And also I suggest that whatever you can do to keep the Head On Radio Network and programs like this on the air, I would suggest to you is very, very important. I mean that very sincerely. I believe that this is a very, very important time in our nation's history, and I think that the idea of giving people access to different points of view and different ideas is very, very critical. For years and years and years, conservatives were making the point and argued that their voice, their position, was not being given equal time, if you will, on America's campuses. And, of course, I know and you know that for at least that many years, America's liberal voice has not been that accessible in terrestrial talk radio either. And, in fact, there's absolutely no question that the strength of conservatism in today's society is in part, at least, I believe, attributable to the growth and the literal explosion of the talk radio phenomenon, which began a number of years ago. And, of course, we have certain names that are associated with that growth, Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck and others. I really appreciate your willingness to be here with us. And, again, our mission is to bring what we believe is information about America's republic, about the nature of our political system, its interpretation, its meaning, and its role in this nation today and in today's world. So again, I thank you for being with us. I encourage you to participate actively in our program by picking up the phone and giving us a call and sharing with our other listeners your ideas, your suggestions, your comments on the issues of the day, or most appropriately on the issue that we happen to be addressing at that time. The phone number to get you on the air here is area code 304-658-3333. That's area code 304-658-3333. And if you'd like to email me directly, I would be more than happy to receive your email, to read it, and if I can, to respond in kind. And what I mean is it takes time to sit down and put your ideas on paper, so to speak, which is to send an email. And I am committed to the idea that as much as possible, I will try to put at least that much time in a response to you if I can, if I know anything about the subject or about the issue at hand. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's WAOBrien, IEN, 906, all one word, @gmail.com. If you remember, during our programs last week, we were looking at some documents primarily coming from colonial Massachusetts. We were dealing with, if you remember, the Dorchester Agreement of 1633, the Mayflower Compact of 1620 in Massachusetts, and then the third document that we dealt with was John Winthrop's very famous City Upon a Hill sermon delivered aboard the Arabella on the way over to the shores of the New World in the year 1630. And if you remember also, we looked at John Winthrop's 1645 speech to the General Court of Massachusetts, focusing especially on Winthrop's ideas of liberty and individual freedom. And I speak to these, just in summary as a refresher. I've been very, very pleased to share, to receive over the weekend, since we've been together last time, several really informative emails. And I want to thank the folks who called, who took the time to send an email and respond. And one of them specifically was from Richard, who acquainted me very honestly with a new website. I wasn't familiar with a website entitled crooksandliars.com, but I probably should be. I'm wondering if there's standing room only at that website. Sometimes you get a feeling that that's probably the case. But what Richard wanted me to know, and I think this was done, with a note of seriousness, but also with a bit of humor as well, that his comment that he commented that I must have touched a nerve last week in talking about the Mayflower Compact, because he picked up a review on Crooks and Liars of a book by Rush Limbaugh entitled Rush Revere and the Brave Pilgrims. And so, of course, his suggestion was that I must have struck a nerve somewhere and caused Rush to write a book over the weekend. And I'm not going to basically suggest that. But I wanted to read you a quote from this review, which I think would be very important to keep in mind. And this is a description of the book, according to this, a quote from Rush Limbaugh that appeared on Slate, the website Slate. And it says the following: "This country is made up of exceptional people and stories of rags to riches. They made it with hard work, determination, a little luck, and God's grace. So in Rush Revere and the Brave Pilgrims, we have brought to life our loving character from if by sea, Rush Revere. We're giving him a horse. We've given him a talking horse. Liberty talks. Liberty has the ability to time travel. So in this book, Rush Revere and Liberty will go to the Mayflower and talk to the pilgrims aboard the Mayflower as they're sailing to what will become America." And then the review goes on and says the following: "Again, it is a unique way of reaching the target audience here, which is America's young people, who are, sadly, not being taught what's in this book. And what's in this book is the historical record, accurate historical record of the Pilgrims. It's who they were, why they existed, where they were, how they got here, what they did when they got here, and what they did and why it mattered and related to the founding of this country." So basically, I think the suggestion here is that, there are a couple of things that we can take for this, and I just wanted to share Richard's email with you. Obviously, I'm not promoting the book. I'm not encouraging anybody to purchase the book or whatever. But what I am suggesting is that this indicates the degree to which the founding is and continues to be a hot topic in American politics. It seems like everybody with a position on anything wants to try to link it to the founders. And the only thing that I would suggest to you is that what that does, what that says to me, at least, is that it is incredibly important that we as citizens, as educated citizens, become much more familiar with the founding, with what they did and why they believed that they needed to do it, and that we need to be appreciative of the fact, in spite of what those who would use the founders and cherry pick quotations from the founders for their own particular agenda. I think it's very important to appreciate the fact that many times what the founders are writing on some of these most relevant and key topics are merely, from their perspective, speculation as well. I would suggest that there are a number of reasons why people write. And of course, one is to communicate, another one is to explain or to share information, to share news, or to communicate facts, pieces of information that the writer believes that people ought to know about. But I would suggest that when writers move into the area of speculation, oftentimes they are not necessarily arguing a definitive position on an issue so much as they are, in effect, searching for explanations. One of the things that I've found in writing, and I trust that a number of you would agree with me, is that one of the so-called invisible benefits of writing, the things that you can't see going in, but oftentimes you can appreciate once the writing has been completed, is that oftentimes we learn from our own writing. And what I mean by that is, sometimes we know more than we think we do. But we really don't appreciate how much we know until we sit down and try to put it into words and explain it, not only to others, but oftentimes just to ourselves. And this kind of reinforces Plato's idea from the allegory of the cave in the Republic, that the things that men need to know most, the knowledge that is most important for people to know, for the most part, is already within them. And the challenge is to bring it out and to get people to appreciate how much they already know. I find this incredibly important for a number of reasons. I think about it in terms of our education system and the degree to which people are more than willing to cite data, chapter and verse, if you will, on the failures of our education system. And one of the things I'm suggesting by this is very little in our education system today plows deep enough or prods deep enough into the individual mind, into the individual psyche, to the point that what's there ever has an opportunity to really come out. On the contrary, usually what's happening in our education system is that new knowledge is being introduced and is being defined as education. But as Plato points out, knowledge, the really important knowledge, the really important things for man to know, are not things that are introduced from outside. They are things that are drawn from within. And Plato even goes to the point and talk about the true educator, the most successful educator, is that person who can find a way to bring knowledge out from people to the point that individuals themselves begin to appreciate how much they already know. And I find writing, especially investigative writing, speculative writing, a way to do that. And I have chosen to believe, I can't cite a letter in which, a George Washington or Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or anybody else says this. But in reading the writings of many of our founders, one of the things that I have noticed, and I've shared this before here at the Virtual Center, and I just kind of wanted to throw this out because it seems appropriate at this time. One of the things that I've noticed is frequently you run into apparent contradictions among the founders. You'll find a Jefferson or a Madison saying one thing at one point, and then in another letter it may be 3 weeks later or 3 years later. will say something which seems to contradict the position taken in the first letter, or in the first commentary if it's a diary that you're reading. And after finding numerous examples of what on the surface are contradictions, and asking myself whether in fact this is, from my perspective, it really seems to be a true contradiction in terms. Is this an indication that the founder who's writing this really doesn't know what he's talking about? Oftentimes what I've found to make sense is that many of the founders are growing. And what I mean is their knowledge of the world they live in and the world that is evolving around them is continuing to grow and blossom. And the result is that their positions on issues can change. I don't find that a criticism. On the contrary, I find that as a very positive thing. The other thing that I found is that oftentimes in writing, people will float ideas to people that they trust, looking for the reaction or the response, looking to engage in some sort of reciprocal dialogue. Because the assumption is, the realization is, and I think many of these people are very aware of this, that in the back and forth exchange that can happen in conversation or in letter writing, everybody learns and grows as a result of the experience. I can remember reading a quote here several weeks ago, and I'm not even going to try to remember, whose quote it is. But I can remember a statement that true knowledge comes from the counter arguments, not from the initial arguments on a point of view, but from the counter arguments. And actually, when I said that, I remembered whose quote this is. It's John Stuart Mill, and from his essay. I believe it's from his essay on liberty. And John Stuart Mill makes the point that the way man learns and the way we really learn is through a dialogue or through an exchange of arguments and counter-arguments. And the most obvious thing about this phenomenon, this idea of argument and counter-argument, is that if it's going to be successful at all, then the one thing it requires is that people pay attention to what the other person that they are having the exchange with is saying. I apologize for the phone in the background. And so basically what we end up with is is the idea that we have much more tendency to focus on what the other person is saying during this kind of an exchange. I mentioned the fact that it's not until I began to do this kind of a program several years ago, it was about a dozen years ago. One of the things that I've noticed is that I've become a much better listener, I believe, since I've been doing this. And part of the reason is because of the calls. I taught for years. I'm almost embarrassed to say, and I think I've mentioned this before, and I apologize for repeating myself. But I almost have to apologize for the number of years I taught. I thought I was a good listener, and I thought when hands went up and a student in a particular class, didn't matter what the issue is, would make a comment or make a response, I always believed that I was a good listener. But the fact of the matter is, depending on how comfortable we are with the material, with the particular subject at hand, oftentimes I used to find myself focusing more on the counter-argument to the comment rather than seriously listening to the comment in its entirety. In other words, what I was doing was listening to somebody, but what I was looking for was not the position or the argument that the person was making, so much as a point to which I could counter, I could respond. And one of the things that I've believed, and I believe it probably more as the years go on, is that too much of our communication, too much of our dialogue, of our conversation, focuses on that counter-argument idea. And the result is that while argument and counter-argument requires that we pay careful attention to the person that we are talking to, excuse me for the pause. While this whole process requires attention, if the focus on it is to win an argument, rather than to develop the point at issue to the degree that everybody learns something that they didn't know going in, which is really the key to, I think, to education. And I'm struck, obviously here by the idea of Socrates and the Socratic method, the dialogue method that Socrates used, of expanding a person's knowledge by asking the series of kind of probing questions, which really brought out more and more and more of what the person that you were speaking with believed and thought and knew about a particular issue. But there's no question that John Stuart Mill had something really, I think, very substantive to say when he talked about the fact that the bulk of what we learn is not through the argument, or perhaps not even through the response to the argument, but it's to the response and counter-response of the counter-arguments that are initiated by this kind of a conversation. You may be saying, where is this going? And I would suggest to you that my point, the reason I raise this at all, is because that's ultimately long-term what I hope that the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility will be about. That the more information we get out there, that we can get out there, the more people begin to appreciate the thinking and the ideas and the substance of what the founders believed and what they wrote and what their intent might have been. And the more we appreciate the fact that these were human beings, and so consequently they too were trying to learn and understand. We always hear about the brilliance, the very famous phrase, the assembly of demigods, Jefferson's phrase in referring to those assembled at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. The fact of the matter is they were human beings. They were learning, thinking human beings. They wanted to know more and grow more, and they found a number of different strategies and ways to do that. And one of them was through the engagement with substantive issues. That's why the dialogues and the letters are so very, very important. But from my perspective, and from the perspective of here at the Virtual Center, I believe that the more substantive information on the Constitution and related issues that we can get out there to the general community at large, the less susceptible people become to the political agendas of those who would put forth their own agenda under the name of one or more of the founders. And what makes it even more difficult sometimes is that when the person making the cherry-picking the founders, so to speak, has enough awareness and knowledge of the subject matter that there's enough substance in there to make it very difficult to spot the innuendo or to spot the fallacies. We spent quite a bit of time a few weeks ago on Cleon Skousen's 5,000-Year Leap and its 28 principles about the American founding, about the principles upon which this nation was founded. And the thing to keep in mind is there's a lot of substance there. There's a lot of good stuff there. However, one needs to understand that there's also a political agenda there. And it's very, very important to constantly pursue enough expertise and insight so that we can begin to spot or to separate or identify the wheat from the chaff, or position or facts from interpretation. And I think that's an issue that all of us, it seems to me, can benefit from by expanding that skill. The point that I wanted to make going in is that many of us find a way to do that. Not the only way, but a way, is by writing. And writing about difficult and controversial issues. And just putting down our own ideas about what we think about things. And what you find is that once you begin to look in black and white at what you begin to at what you think about things, you begin to notice connections and inferences and perhaps contradictions in things within your own thinking, and you begin to clarify them. One of the points that I was making today, and this is a point that I've made here at the Virtual Center several weeks ago. I was talking to a history class this morning about this fact. From April of 1787, which is a month before the Constitutional Convention was scheduled to convene, May 14th, 1787, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson being in France, Madison and Jefferson began an exchange of letters on the constitutional system, which extended from April of 87 until the fall of 88, well into September of 1788, which is about a total of about 16 months. Over the course of those 16 months, excuse me, Madison and Jefferson exchanged letters in excess of 35 times. I'm remembering either 37 letters or 39 letters back and forth. I can't remember which it is. But the point is, it was in excess of 35 of these substantive exchanges. And when I say substantive, I mean substantive. These are not short paragraphs. These are, in using today's social media and the vernacular that's often used, these were not tweets. These were not exchanges that were limited to 140 characters. These were extensive paragraphs, multi-page exchanges between two thinking, bright individuals on particular issues related to American government and American politics. If you remember, Madison, prior to the convening of the Constitutional Convention in May of 1787, put together his own document, which he entitled Vices of the American Political System. And the date on that document, Madison's date, is April 1787. And he sends it to those whose opinions he values. And one of them is Jefferson. And he wants to bounce off of people whose opinion he values, his ideas and his criticisms of the Confederation government, of the Articles of Confederation, what he believed needed to be changed and why. And what he was looking for was their insights and their knowledge and their wisdom as he prepared for what, at that point in his life, no question, was the greatest political challenge of his life, which was to basically go to the convention and successfully persuade a majority of the delegates that the Constitution under which the nation functioned, which was the Articles of Confederation, was so weak and so out of touch with political reality that the best thing that the members of the convention could do was to scrap it and agree to come up with something better. And it's at that point that Madison distributes copies of what becomes the Virginia Plan, which is the first draft of the Constitution of the United States. My point is, there is absolutely no substitute if you intend, if I intend, if anyone intends to understand the nature of the Constitution of the United States. How can we possibly think that we're doing that without reading the exchanges between Madison and Jefferson, between Madison and Benjamin Rush, between Madison and George Washington? As we begin to get their thinking about Madison's thinking. This is before they go into the convention. It is absolutely vital that in order to understand the founding, the framers of the Constitution of the United States, that we understand these issues and these perspectives, because they form the basis for the discussions and the dialogues which take place throughout the summer of 1787 before a final draft of the Constitution of the United States is agreed to and released, is submitted to the Continental Congress and to the states for their ratification. There's so much wisdom and so much insight. And again, if Madison was telling Jefferson, using those two just as an example of a principle which is much bigger and extends to more people than just those two. But if Madison had approached, in his letters to Jefferson, that communication from the point of view, this is the way it is, this is truth, this is what I know, this is what you must subscribe to, he never would have gotten a response, at least a substantive response. He might have gotten a very sarcastic, critical response. But chances are he wouldn't have got anything back that was substantive. But by approaching the experience, by requesting dialogue and requesting response to these issues, this is what I think we're about, this is where I think we ought to go, and this is why I think we should go there. What do you think? Think about the value of that in terms of how we define communication and conversation. Think about the number of conversations that you've had in your day-to-day existence within the last couple of weeks where a person approaches you about an issue from a perspective like that, which is in effect saying to you, putting yourself in the position of Jefferson here. I've spent a lot of time doing a lot of research and a lot of thinking about this particular issue. Here's what I think we ought to do. Here's the reasons I think we ought to do it. Here's what I've learned in my research about previous peoples who have tried to do a similar thing. And here's why I think this is our best shot. What do you think? Think about how respectful that kind of communication is. What Madison would be saying to Jefferson in that particular circumstance is, I respect your opinion, your insight, and your wisdom enough that I'm willing to bounce off of you ideas and theories that I'd feel pretty comfortable with, but I'm not sure about. And the only way that I can become even more sure than I am now is to solicit and receive your approval or your agreement. And if you don't agree, and you can tell me why, then that's going to send me back to the drawing board, and what I'm planning to propose to the convention will even be better and more solid. Can you think what our world would be like if people communicated with each other from that kind of a perspective? When Bob Kincaid, here on the Head On Radio Network talks about conversation and requests your support in order to keep the conversation alive, that's the kind of conversation that Bob Kincaid is talking about. That's the kind of conversation that we need to have more of in our society today. We need not only to have people talking, we need to have people listening. And we need to have the interaction between the talkers and the listeners. We need to have that conversation based on a degree of respect. One person, one party for the other. And when that happens, knowledge surfaces. Truth surfaces. That's the way we grow. That's the way we expand. That's the way we learn. And that's the way we have the opportunity to become transmitters of knowledge rather than merely receptors of knowledge. That's the kind of dialogue that is the mission here of the Virtual Center. And we talked, Bob Kincaid and his folks and I have talked a lot in recent weeks about ways that we can make this happen here on the Horn at the Virtual Center. We're talking about, right now we're streaming audio. We're talking about not only interactive audio, but interactive video as well. We're talking about tapping into and using the latest technology that we can use, not in order to explain and expand people's understanding of some of these critical issues. And let me tell you something that I truly believe. I believe this with all my heart. I believe that the more successful we are in this, the better we are able to do this, the more knowledgeable people we're going to be dealing with. And the more knowledgeable people we're going to be dealing with, the less political tripe and half-truths and out-and-out sarcasm and lies and innuendo, which passes for truth, will disappear from our political dialogue. I fully believe that. I believe that some of the reasons why our political conversation today, in many cases, not all cases, in many cases, is so lacking in substance, is because there is a basic assumption out there that the average person, the general population, is so ignorant about these things that they'll buy anything. And all we need to do is put whatever it is we want them to believe in the right language with the right inflection and use our most persuasive language and abilities, and we can get people to believe anything. I believe that's what's going on out there. I believe that for a number of years is what has driven terrestrial talk radio. I do not think it's dialogue. I do not believe it's conversation. I think to the people who participate in this, they believe it's a regular visitation with truth. They go to those whose positions most comport or conform to their own. And they listen to people who are saying the very same things that they already believe and that they want to believe. And they leave believing what they believed going in even more than they did when they started. They really haven't learned anything. They really haven't expanded their horizons or their knowledge one little whit. What they are merely doing is going back to the well and reinforcing their belief system, but they are not expanding their world and their understanding and appreciation of the world around them. In addition to that, they are not gaining exposure to people who could so expand and understand their knowledge and appreciation of issues and events which make up the world around them. They consciously avoid encounter with those who disagree with them They're much more comfortable with the kind of encounter that isn't really an encounter at all. It's a visitation with people who totally believe. It's almost like a Sunday morning in church, where the pastor elaborates on some element, some aspect, or some portion of Scripture, and basically expounds on the particular position or ideological position that that particular congregation has on that particular issue. And frequently what we hear from the congregation is an amen. Total agreement. No question, no dissent, whatever. That's one of the things that, as we think back to John Winthrop's position in his speech on City on a Hill and in his speech to the General Court of Massachusetts on liberty, it's important to recognize that in John Winthrop's world, which was the Puritan world of the 17th century, there's no room for dissent. There's no room for something called the loyal opposition. There's no room for something called majority rule or majority position and minority position. There's consensus. Because if what is being expounded is God's word and God's truth, then there's no room for expansion, for criticism, for a minority position, for a dissenting report. We talked on the Supreme Court when we read these decisions. We have the majority decisions, the people who agree with the decision of the majority of the court. And then frequently those who disagree will issue their own dissenting opinion. In Winthrop's world, there's no room for dissenting opinions. There's no room for the other side. There's one side. And it is within that context that Winthrop is defining and explaining the meaning of liberty in 1645. Liberty is not the freedom to disagree. Liberty is the freedom to do that which is good, just, and honest. One of the students in my class this morning, we handed out that document, and they got into groups and talked a little bit about the liberty portion of John Winthrop's speech. And in the discussion that followed, one of the students made the point, well, let me go back a little bit and put it into context. The discussion tended to revolve around Winthrop's discussion in that speech of the relationship between husband and wives. And a couple of the husbands and wives, not husband and wives. If it's husband and wives, you got a problem. So that was a major faux pas. But Winthrop's, in talking about the relationship between husbands and wives, what he is doing is using an example of the relationship between government and citizen responsibility in God's community. And what he's saying, and this is exactly what the student said, he said, I think the more we talk about the husband and wife issue in Winthrop, the more we're losing the point that Winthrop is using that as an example of something bigger. He's not talking about husband and wife relations in this speech. He's talking about the ideal relationship between husband and wife as an example of the proper role of citizen in community, in society. And Winthrop's position is that man needs order in order to be free. By definition, disorder is chaos. And disorder exists when man is free to do, as Winthrop said, whatever he lists, which means whatever he chooses to do, Winthrop defines that as natural freedom and says that's the same freedom that man has in common with animals. You do not have order. You do not have predictability. You do not have stability. You do not have security in that kind of an environment. The only way that man can be free, according to Winthrop, is when there is order, when there are rules, and when everybody agrees with and subscribes to those rules and agrees to submit to them. When you have that, you have the ideal community. And when you have the ideal community, you have achieved God's ideal community. When you have that, you have man experiencing the epitome of freedom, of liberty. That's Winthrop's point. And the husband and wife relationship is merely an example of that. I thought that the comments that this student made were just absolutely top of the line, absolutely superb. But again, I think it's important to recognize that there's no place in this world, in Winthrop's world, for dissent or disagreement. So we're not talking here about conversation. We're not talking about argument and counter-argument. We're not talking about learning from counter-argument. We're talking about the transmission of unquestioned, unadulterated truth. That's Winthrop's whole point. That God's community is based on God's will, on God's plan, as revealed in Scripture. And man's challenge is to set up the ideal community as God wants it set up. And those who are responsible for the administration of that community, his role as governor, elected officials, as representatives of the general court, for example, those who are elected to administer this truth owe their loyalty and responsibility to God, not to the citizens who elect them. Winthrop makes this point. You may choose me as your representative, but my responsibility is not to you. My responsibility is to God and my commitment to enact His will. Which means that once you elect me, you lose control over me. You lose the right to tell me what to do. What you are doing when you elect me, when you vote for me, is you are saying, I trust you to do the best job of all the other choices that were available to us in this election. I trust you to do the best job of enacting God's plan. Because I fully believe that if you are successful in enacting God's plan, we'll all benefit, we'll all experience the maximum freedom, and we will have the ideal community as God intended us to have. That, to Winthrop, is the mission in his document he calls, in his speech, he calls it the commission of this people to establish what he calls a city upon a hill. The eyes of all the world will be upon us. That's the reform mission that these people believe that they have. I think it is absolutely important that we understand that and that we understand the context within which that happens. Timely sip of coffee there, and I thank you for it. So I wanted to share that with you, for one thing, in order to kind of refresh your memory as to where we were last week and what we were talking about, and in order to prepare for this week and probably a little bit beyond this week. I think what this does is set us up for a series of programs on the whole issue of rights and responsibilities. The first place that it occurs to us to go is the Bill of Rights, is the American Bill of Rights. It is so ironic. I'm saying this because we're approaching, we have 10 minutes to go before the end of our first hour together today. And I kind of want to lay this groundwork, and then we can pick it up in our second hour and begin this exploration of the whole issue of rights and liberties, which I think could take us to really exciting places, and I mean that very sincerely. It is absolutely vital for us all to keep in mind always that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, were not part of the original document. If you remember, Madison and the other Federalists fought valiantly, fought feverishly throughout the Convention of 1787 to resist the anti-Federalist argument about the need for a Bill of Rights. Their rationalization, you can almost guess. You can read the letters of prominent anti-Federalists, and you will find that the common denominator is that most of them argued, most of the anti-Federalists, most of the opponents of this new Constitution argued that a government with this kind of power, as the sense of the convention and the sense of the Virginia plan and the idea of the Constitution began to dawn on its leading opponents in convention, many of them began to realize and began to believe that a government with the kind of power that this Constitution suggests the new central government would have is a government that's going to have so much power over the states that even if people live in a state with a Bill of Rights, with its own Bill of Rights, the state's protection of individual rights theoretically is going to be trumped by the new federal government power as being revealed in the Constitution. In other words, it's wonderful that we have state bills of rights to protect our freedoms. But if we create a government over the states, then what is to prevent an abuse of our individual freedoms by this new government, in response to which our states would be powerless to protect us? It's an argument that seems to make sense unless you do what the Federalists did, what the supporters of the Constitution did, which was to deny the realities of the total power that the new federal government would have under the Constitution, by stressing things like checks and balances and separation of powers. The internal system of checks and balances within the system, Madison believed that you could counter, that you could deflect critics' attention from the total power being realized by the new federal government under this Constitution. It's an effort at diversion. There's no other way to say it. Madison is on record in private letters as suggesting that you never, by you, I mean the people he's talking to us who are supporters of the Constitution, you never allow the conversation to get around to the total power of the federal government vis-a-vis each state. Because that's an argument, that's a perspective that is very, very difficult to argue against, to counter. What Madison says you must do is you must drive the attention of critics into the document itself and emphasize things like the powers of the president over Congress, the powers of Congress to control the purse in order to control presidential behavior, the power of the Supreme Court to strike down a law that's passed when it is found to be potentially unconstitutional. That idea of judicial power to rule laws unconstitutional is not made official until 1803 in the Marbury versus Madison case. But many of the delegates presume that that's what courts do. And so it's kind of, you can kind of read between the lines during the debates of the Constitutional Convention and begin to recognize that there seems to be an ongoing assumption that the rights of the federal court to interpret the constitutionality of particular pieces of state legislation is there for the, it's going to happen. And I think many of them realized it. But Madison's whole point is that you divert the attention back into the document. In other words, you never talk about the forest. You always talk about the individual trees which make up the forest. And if you get people to focus their attention on the trees, they never have an opportunity to stand back far enough and gain enough perspective to recognize the totality of the forest. And that's a major part of the Federalist strategy to get the Constitution ratified. So in a sense, the dialogue, the conversation between anti-federalists and federalists is never really the kind of conversation we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes here. We've not been talking about the idea of people wanting to learn by engaging in dialogue, in conversation with people whose wisdom and insight they respect. What we're talking about here is the ability of those within a particular agenda to bury the agenda of their opponents, and vice versa. And one of the issues is the lack of a Bill of Rights on the Constitution. And for a long time, Madison and his acolytes, his supporters, are adamant in their resistance to the idea of a Bill of Rights. And they come up with some pretty good arguments, actually, to deny the need for a federal Bill of Rights. One of the most obvious, most common arguments is, we are creating a government that receives its power to govern from the consent of the governed. The power of Congress to legislate derives directly from the power of the people who elect these people to be their representatives. The fact that there are frequent elections for members of Congress every 2 years means that the voters will have an opportunity to hold their elected representatives accountable on a regular basis for what they are doing and the way they are voting, the way that they are representing the interests of their constituents. So there's plenty of opportunity in the exercise of the ballot to hold your elected officials accountable. Therefore, it's not necessary to issue a slate of human rights or individual rights that are to be protected from government, because the argument is that there are so many checks and balances built into the system that a government with this much responsibility to its own people is not likely to be able to abuse the rights of those same people. Pretty solid argument. The other argument that Madison makes, which I find even more solid, is his argument that it is dangerous to start spelling out individual rights, because in doing that, you are sending a message to people that if a particular right is overlooked, if a particular right is not mentioned in the list of rights identified, then the implication is that that right doesn't exist. And so Madison's argument is the danger of identifying specific rights is that you might overlook some. And in the long term, the effort to spell out in a Bill of Rights the rights that people have might actually end up being a negative rather than a positive. It might end up denying people more rights than they actually ought to have. Again, pretty sound, pretty solid argument. The issue of rights is critical, but lost in the debate is the issue of responsibilities, and that's part of it. Winthrop doesn't ignore that. He's constantly talking about the issue of civic responsibility. But the point I'm trying to make is that as we go into a discussion of rights and responsibilities, we need to recognize that we are doing it in a world, in a political world, where there has been an inordinate amount of attention on rights and a very paltry sense of responsibilities. That's the context within which I'd like to begin a series of programs on the whole issue of rights and responsibilities. It is exactly 5 p.m. here in the East, which means we have completed our first hour. Let's pause and take a 5-minute break and give us an opportunity to stretch and maybe reflect on a few things. It's a perfect opportunity to pick up the phone and call with your ideas and your comments. The number, again, is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. It's 1 minute after the hour. We'll be back in 5 minutes to the virtual center. Please stay tuned. This is Bill O'Brien back with you for our second hour here on this Monday, this beautiful Monday afternoon. Our second hour at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And I welcome you to the program if you're just joining us. If you've been with us through the first hour, then I really thank you for staying with us, and I mean that. There are so many things that you could choose to do with your time, and the fact that you choose to stay with us is, to me, a tremendous testimony to the fact that what we're setting out trying to do here, which is to provide information that you can use and that you will find valuable, is, to a degree at least, being achieved. And I want to thank you for that very much. If you are joining us, I want to welcome you, and I hope that this won't be your first time at the Virtual Center or to tune into the Horn. Try to get used to these, to the Horn, to the Head On Radio Network, and to the programming that it offers. We are one here at the Virtual Center. But I think you will find that there's a perspective here, a position that needs to be out there and needs to be heard. And the folks at Head On, Bob Kincaid and his people, are depending to a large degree on you, the listeners, to keep that voice out there and keep this conversation going and conversation alive. So let me do everything that I can do to encourage you and thank you for your willingness to tune in and hopefully your support for, and in some cases devotion to, the Head On Radio Network. Here at the Virtual Center, one of our missions, submissions if you will, is to try to achieve that same kind of commitment from our participants, from our listeners. I basically vow to do the best I can to achieve that. Our phone number, that the number that you can use to participate actively in our program and get on the air and give our other listeners an opportunity to hear your ideas and your thoughts, area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you would like to email me directly and share your ideas and your perspectives and your comments about a particular program or a particular issue, by all means, I welcome them. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's all one word, waobrien906@gmail.com. And O'Brien is I-E-N. So many people are inclined to spell it I-A-N. It is I-E-N in this particular case. If you are just joining us, we were talking about the whole issue of dialogue and conversation as leading to expanding knowledge. I think in the course of that discussion, we made reference to John Stuart Mill. We made more than one reference to Plato and his allegory of the cave. And we have, and indeed, we made reference to Rush Limbaugh. Let's be fair. We talked about Rush Limbaugh's recent book entitled Rush Revere and the Brave Pilgrims. And this is Rush's revisit to the Pilgrims and to the Mayflower Compact and those who did it and what they were about and all the rest of it. And that basically kind of created the circumstances for the bulk of our first hour here at the Virtual Center today. As I mentioned at the close of the last hour, and I'd like to kind of pick up where we left off, it seems to me that a fairly detailed examination and look at the whole issue of rights and liberties is called for. And the justification for this is in part the nature of our political dialogue, or political conversation today, or the lack thereof. And I personally think there's more lack thereof than there is conversation and dialogue going on. Because more often than not, what we have seen happen is a rather clearly distinct division in society on particular issues and particular ideologies. And too often, the conversation between them, first of all, is too infrequent. But second, more often than not, they tend to talk beyond or right past each other. Most of the real conversation happens within each camp. And what I mean by real conversation is the willingness to tune in and listen. That's where most of the conversation is happening. Most of the talk is happening. It may not be conversation in the context within which we've defined it here during our first hour, which is argument, counter-argument, and counter-argument back, a reciprocal relationship based on two sides, both of whom represent and respect each other and the insights that the other brings to the table. And the idea being that when our conversation is over, we will be able to walk away from it knowing more than we did coming in. Both sides will be able to say that. When that happens, that's true dialogue. That's a true conversation. That's what we are after. And so one of the arguments that is often made in order to make sure that that kind of conversation happens is that if you are participating in that kind of a conversation, and we talked about the example of Madison and Jefferson who did that in a series of letter exchanges during 1787 and 88 related to the Constitution and its ratification. Those letters are not designed to halt conversation and interaction, but to continue to support it, to make sure that conversation and dialogue continues. In other words, neither side is after the slam dunk in this conversation. One is not looking to outdo the other on some sort of 18th century version of crossfire. The alternative, what they are in a sense doing is approaching each other from a position of respect. And they are saying, here's what I think, here's what I believe, here's why I believe it. Please react to it because I trust you to bring wisdom and insight to it that I may have overlooked or neglected. And when that kind of conversation and back and forth dialogue that happens in that kind of a context happens, both sides walk away knowing more than they did when they came in. I think that we are facing a similar conversation or a similar issue when we talk about the issue of rights and responsibilities in our society today. Because of the nature of our political dialogue, and I can expand on that a little bit if you'd like, but because of the nature of our political dialogue, much more of the conversation focuses on rights, and less of that conversation focuses on responsibilities. And the reason for it is obvious. Most of our political conversation today, no matter what the issue is, the immediate issue is, tends to revolve around the power of government. Whether in fact government is overreaching, over-exercising more power than it has a right to claim. And all of that is based on the assumption, on the idea, which is a 16th and 17th century assumption, that the greatest threat to individual liberty is government. And so the 17th and 18th century idea was that human liberty, human freedom, is inversely proportional to the size and power and ability to act of government. The more government there is, the less freedom there is. The less government there is, the more freedom there is. And to use that in our own political system, many people will go to Jefferson's famous comment that government governs best which governs least. There's no question that Jefferson believed that. There's no question that Jefferson believed that an overreaching government that sought or believed that it had the right to interfere and make every decision on every issue was a direct threat to individual freedom. There's no question that he believed that. But to take that principle and expand it into the idea that what you do is devalue, refuse to fund, or starve the beast, as one Washington right-wing pundit expressed it, that individual freedom is expanded if you literally disarm or disable government. And the result of that conversation, of that context, of a conversation that happens in that context, the result is that there's very little attention given to civic responsibility, because the assumption is that the whole name of the game is to expand individual freedom and individual liberty, and that the only way to do it is to reduce or disarm or disable government, because government is the institution most capable of limiting and restricting that individual freedom that you so love and you so want to expand. That is a loaded political argument. That argument does a tremendous disservice to the founders, who recognized very well that in order for a republic to function, you had to have an active, involved, participating citizenry. And the expression used by many of the founders is an educated citizenry. And we have spent time debating here at the Virtual Center what they meant or might have meant by the idea of an educated citizenry. Is that a citizenry that education tells them what to believe, or is it a citizenry that is really in search of the kind of knowledge that gives them the wisdom to tell government what it wants government to do? I would suggest to you that there's a major difference there, but let's not go there now. So that's the context. And I would suggest to you that Winthrop's City on a Hill speech and his inordinate effort to go out of the way to define and explain and give example after example of the importance and the circumstances surrounding the creation of God's community is a classic evidence that if this is God's community committed to enacting and enforcing God's laws, then the kind of freedom that Winthrop is talking about is the freedom that comes from that community, not freedom that is exercised in spite of that community, if that makes sense. What we are talking about, what Winthrop is talking about, is the kind of community that creates the environment where freedom is possible, not the kind of environment where freedom is limited. And not to put words in Winthrop's mouth, but he himself talks about natural liberty being man's belief that he has the freedom to do whatever he lists. This is Winthrop's term for the right to do whatever you want. Freedom to do whatever man lists. And Winthrop points out that's the same kind of freedom that animals have. But Winthrop says in his speech that kind of freedom is inconsistent with the legitimate authority. It can't function within an ordered society. It requires a disordered society in order to operate. And the last thing that these people want is a disordered society, because the mission they are on is to create just the opposite. And so the definition of freedom they talk about is a definition of freedom that is consistent with authority rather than in opposition to it. Or, as Winthrop says, rather than being a distemper thereof. I think that is incredibly important, because what Winthrop is talking about here is that responsibility precedes freedom. The mere fact that you set out to create a community like this is, or seems to be, I would argue, I'm putting words in Winthrop's mouth here, but I would argue that what Winthrop probably would say is the mere fact that you are setting out to create a community like this is not only because you've been commissioned by God to do it, but also because man's freedom can't even exist until you do it. The disorder that surrounds the lack of such a community is a disorder which makes the kind of freedom that Winthrop is talking about impossible. So Winthrop's idea is the creation of an ordered society with rules and regulations that everybody agrees on is not the enemy to individual freedom. It's rather the basis for individual freedom. If a government is to govern in a republic that receives its power to govern from the consent of the governed, then government's priority, it would seem to me, ought to be to fashion or create a similar type of community for the same reasons, that the more successful we are in shaping community around the values and the morals that we all agree on is what we're all about, then we are not inhibiting freedom. We are, in effect, allowing freedom. We are giving freedom an opportunity to function. So, in a sense, you have two different perspectives here on the whole issue of government's relationship to freedom. From one side, from the left, from liberals in today's world, is the idea that freedom comes from a well-ordered society rather than being limited by that society. Conservatives, on the other hand, would argue just the opposite, that individual freedom exists independent of society or government, and that the more government and the more order and more management there is, the less individual freedom there is. I would suggest to you, well, I was going to say something that probably requires clarification, so let me go back and kind of rephrase what I was going to say. I was going to say that if you are committed to, if you are a conservative in today's world, if you subscribe to the antithesis of freedom and order, if you believe that they are inconsistent with each other, and that a government which can govern is a direct threat to individual freedom, if you subscribe to that, then you obviously are denying some pretty important historical evidence here which contradicts you, one of those sources being John Winthrop himself. I think that's very important. On the other hand, we have to consider something else. And that something else is the creation of an economic system or a set of economic givens or ideology that we call free enterprise capitalism, which demands an emphasis on individual freedom and demands an emphasis on self-interest. We have bought into, and I'm not suggesting that this is a mistake, so please don't misinterpret what I'm saying, but we have bought into an economic system which is driven by self-interest, a self-interest which requires a degree of individual freedom in order to be satisfied. And that relationship, that connection between self-interest and the freedom to satisfy it is what drives our economic system. It drives our economy. But the fact of the matter is, it is inconsistent with some of the realities of the world that existed before it and continue to exist around it. To argue for a government that can govern, to recognize the realities of balance between individual freedom on the one hand and a functioning, active, viable government on the other, is not to deny an either-or position in this particular case. It is to suggest that the answer lies somewhere between the two. To suggest that today's challenges are all about rights and not at all about responsibilities, to me, is what I would call political spin. It is political untruth. It identifies the ingredients of a particular political agenda. It is not an effort to engage in dialogue in search of answers. It is an effort to impose answers for a dialogue that its proponents hope will never happen. I would suggest to you that the very existence of the virtual center here on the Head On Radio Network is a commitment that that dialogue has to happen, and darn it will happen. And that's kind of what we're about. You'll remember in Winthrop's speech on liberty to the General Court in 1645, Winthrop made the statement to the court and said, the great questions that have troubled the country, in 1645, of course, are about the authority of the magistrates and the liberty of the people. How ironic, how unbelievable it is that the great questions which troubled the country in 1645, which is in Massachusetts, colonial Massachusetts, were the authority of government on the one hand and the liberty of people on the other. And the great issues which divide the country today in the year 2013 are about the legitimate authority of government on the one hand and the whole idea of individual freedom on the other. It seems like maybe we have learned nothing. It seems like there's an awful lot in our past, in our history, that somehow we didn't learn from. I would suggest to you that we find ourselves caught up in an educational system which is committed to the idea that we, if everything goes right, will never learn from this past. Because we are dealing with a society that in the eyes of some people seems to function best within a community of civic ignorance about its own history and its own government. And that's the reason why I think that we are bound here at the Virtual Center to undertake a fairly extensive study over the next several days of the issue of rights and liberties. We are at the bottom of the hour. It is 30 minutes after the hour, and we have 1/2 hour to go in today's program. And what I want to do is kind of lead in to this idea of rights and liberties by moving away from John Winthrop a little bit, recognizing that you can't ever get too far away from John Winthrop's ideas as long as there are people out there who continue to scream about American exceptionalism. You're going to have attention drawn to John Winthrop's City on a Hill speech. But it is absolutely critical that when we hear that and hear reference to it, we understand what it means. And we understand how Winthrop's definition of freedom meshes with it rather than being alien to it. They are consistent. Community power, government authority, and freedom are consistent, provided government is adhering to its responsibility to promote the general welfare. If government is doing that, then individual freedom is not inhibited. I would suggest to you it is expanded and enhanced. I'm going to make reference to a document, and I'm going to ask, before we get our website completed here at the Virtual Center, and I can post such a document, I'm going to ask that if you have time and plan, and hopefully you will, to be with us for future programs, I'd like to begin now for the rest of our program today, but pick up again tomorrow in even more detail, and look at the Massachusetts Body of Liberties enacted in 1641. Again, it's the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. A document, it is a document, a set of laws, in effect, a Bill of Rights, enacted by the Massachusetts legislature in 1641, which is during the John Winthrop period, when John Winthrop was governor. It's during the Puritan period. And so all the things that we've said about Puritanism and about the congregational approach to Protestantism in talking about John Winthrop applied to this document as well. And I think it's very important to recognize that that's the context within this happens, within this document exists. Why would we go back to this particular document? Well, not only because it is a document where rights are identified, defined, and articulated within the context of people who believe that they are in the midst of creating the ideal community. Let me put it another way. The specific details of the Massachusetts Body of Liberty in 1641, these details represent or reflect the rights and the freedoms of citizens who are living in a perfect community. I need to tell you that this is a long document. Let me be specific. There are 98 provisions to the Massachusetts Body of Liberty. Not only that, but some of the provisions have sub-provisions. If you print out this document, which I did today, it prints out to 13 pages. You can find it on the internet. Again, just Google or type in on your browser, on Microsoft Explorer, just type in Massachusetts, MASS, Body of Liberties, 1641. And you will find site after site after site where you will find copies of this particular document. What is there about this document that makes it relevant? Obviously, there's more to it than the fact that I happen to grow up in Massachusetts, believe me. There's more to it that Massachusetts happens to be the home of the Boston Red Sox and the New England Patriots, believe me. I'm not pushing a political agenda here or a personal agenda of any kind. What I am saying is the reason we begin here is because this document seems to be the basis for every Bill of Rights or such document like it passed in nations of the world ever since then. Let me put it another way. There has not been a Bill of Rights passed in the world that I know about that does not incorporate items and issues that are included in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641. The reason that it's so long is because it is so complete and definitive. Every Bill of Rights enacted by man since this, and I'm talking about a Bill of Rights in the Soviet Union as well as the American Bill of Rights or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen enacted in 1789 or reenacted a second version in 1793. What I'm basically suggesting is that the rights that are being included in Bills of Rights in the modern world have their origins in this document. It doesn't mean necessarily that they all go to this document to get their information. It's the fact that thinking people, since all the way back in the 1640s, believed that if you have a society or a community which is really a community, and these people believed that they did because they believed that God would punish them if they veered away from their commission. So they had everything to gain and nothing to lose by trying to set up as closely as they could God's perfect community. And here they are in 1641 saying, so far, this is the best we can do. And given the fact that we are where we are doing the best we can, these are the rights that the individual citizen living in an ideal community must have. What a statement. There's no we're not separating here. We're not talking about the issue of inalienable rights, or what John Locke called natural rights, or what some people refer to as God-given rights or absolute rights. We're not separating them from what other people refer to as civil rights. Notice, we, for reasons that we'll talk about, we have chosen to separate or to distinguish between God's rights and government's rights, inalienable rights and civil rights, rights that exist prior to and over and above government, as opposed to rights which exist only because of their endorsement and approval and acceptance by government. For some reasons, we have chosen to separate those two groups. The Puritans were in an ideal situation in 1641 because the world they lived in, God's rights and civil rights were the same thing. Because they believed that their mission was to create the perfect society, the perfect community, according to the map of such a community given to them in Scripture. So their job was not to separate government rights and godly rights. Their job was to identify all rights by pointing out that what rights seemed to be directly attributable to government were in fact attributable to God, because government itself was directly connected to the will and the plan of God. So with that introduction, if I may, let's begin the process of looking at the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641 for its content. Now remember, this is not a class, a credit class. There is not a test on this or a quiz on this in the morning. The other thing, I have asked you on your computer to find the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. I think if I were you, I would print it. Or at least I would have it available during programs so that as we talk about it, you'll have a direct copy of the document itself right in front of you. The purpose of our visitation, the purpose of our visiting this document is not to identify all the rights. I don't want to take you through every one of the 98 provisions contained in this document. I'd like to identify and target some of them because I think they are significant. One of the things that you're going to find, that we will find, which I think is relevant, very relevant, is that you're going to be surprised, because I am. I continue to be surprised at some of what's in here. Because many of the issues that in today's world we believe are none of government's business, to the Massachusetts Puritans of 1641, everything was God's business. Everything that human beings, the individual, did was God's business. And how God treated his people, his community, was directly related to how closely people adhered to his business. So we're going to find in this document that there's specific attention paid to the way parents raise children. There's going to be particular attention paid to the way husbands treat wives and wives treat husbands. There's going to be a particular attention paid to how people treat religion, how people deal with God's word, how people deal with the ministers of God's word. What we're going to find is that many of the things that in today's world we define as private rights, the Puritans knew and believed were public rights. What happens, to put it in today's context, to the Puritans, what happens in Las Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. It becomes everybody's business. Because if the wrong things happen in Vegas, and we don't do anything about it, we're all going to pay the price. Notice, God deals with the entire community, not the individual souls within it. God holds the entire community responsible for the behavior of its citizens and the choices made by its citizens. What you do or don't do, how you live or don't live, is not your private business. It is not between you and your God, between you and your priest in the confessional or anything else. What you do and how you do it in what you believe to be your private life is not your private life at all. It's everybody's business. And it's only by making sure that it's everybody's business that you continue to exercise the freedom to do it. Our responsibility as a community is to make sure that the freedoms that you are exercising are freedoms that are consistent with authority and with law, rather than inconsistent with it. Our job is to make sure that you are not permitted to exercise your innate human nature inclination to do evil or to do bad. John Winthrop said it for us. If you believe that freedom is the right to do whatever you want to do, you are no better than the animals of the jungle, of the forest. There is disorder, and there's no freedom for anybody. But if you subscribe to authority and to the legitimate freedom that extends from that authority and from that order, not only will you profit, will you benefit, but the rest of us will benefit as well. So this idea that there are certain rights that you have which are private, and then other rights you have which are public, don't fly in 17th century Massachusetts. So with that, let me share the introductory paragraphs. Before we get into the very first item, let me share with you the introductory paragraph to the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, passed by the Massachusetts General Court in December of 1641. And here's what it said. And a lot of this is written in the Old English, so you almost have to read it aloud, because even though the spelling is different, the words pronounced are the same words today. The free fruition of such liberties, immunities, and privileges as humanity, civility, and Christianity call for, as due to every man in his place and proportion. Let me go back. The free fruition, bringing to fruition, into being, the liberties, immunities, and privileges as humanity, civility, and Christianity, all of these call for, as due to every man in his place and proportion. In his place and proportion. There is a recognition here that everybody is not equal. Some people are in a different place than other people. These people believe that God's ideal society creates particular duties for particular people. And the sum total of all these people doing their assigned duties creates the perfect community. And these people believed that each of us is called, if you have any kind of a religious background at all, especially a Christian one, you are familiar with the idea of being called. The assumption is that whatever you do in life, you were called to do it by God. You were called to be a doctor or a minister or a representative or a governor or a teacher or a person who picks up the trash or sweeps the gutter or whatever it is you do. The idea is you play an important role in the community, and it is all the people within the community doing their assigned jobs or their callings that helps to create the ideal community. So there's no recognition here of equality. There's not even recognition here that everybody's equal in the eyes of God. These people set out to basically say that the liberties, immunities, and privileges one has need to be consistent with his place and proportion, where different people are going to get different amounts of the immunities, liberties, and privileges. Without impeachment and infringement have ever been and ever will be the tranquility and stability of churches and commonwealths. Again, let me go back. The fruition of the liberties, immunities, and privileges that are human, civil, and Christian shall be due to every man according to his place and his proportion. And without impeachment and infringement, they have ever been and will always be the tranquility and stability of churches and commonwealths. These liberties, immunities, and privileges are the basis of a stable, tranquil, peaceful church and commonwealth. The same kinds of circumstances that create order and community within church are the kinds of communities necessary to create order and stability in commonwealths, in the community at large. And then the document goes on and says, and the denial or deprival thereof, the disturbances, if not the ruin of both. To deny or deprive these rights to any human being, recognizing that the rights and privileges are commensurate with one's position and the proportion that one gets of these rights and privileges is a function of his position. To deny or deprive people of their legitimate rights, immunities, and liberties, whether in church or commonwealth, will cause disturbance within the group, if not the ruin of both churches and communities. You cannot have order and stability. You cannot have community unless you are willing to recognize the legitimate rights and privileges of the citizens who live there. As I think about today's society, I keep wondering. He goes on, the document goes on, we hold it therefore our duty and safety, whilst we are about the further establishing of this government, to collect and express all such freedoms as for present we foresee may concern us and our posterity after us, and to ratify them with our solemn consent. Because we believe that the recognition of these rights and responsibilities is the basis of a stable community as well as a stable religious community or society. Therefore, we see it as our duty and our safety, while we are in the process of establishing our government, to collect and express all of the freedoms, not only for people who are with us now, but may concern us as well as our posterity, those who come after us, and to ratify them with our solemn consent. We do, therefore, this day, religiously and unanimously, decree and confirm these following rights, liberties, and privileges concerning our churches and civil state, to be respectively impartially and inviolably enjoyed and observed throughout our jurisdiction forever. These are the rights that people must have in order to have functioning, viable churches and functioning, viable civil states, societies. And, of course, the idea is that the two are connected. You can't have one without the other. Therefore, it is absolutely vital that we identify and express these, we confirm them, and we ratify them. And before we go off the air, it's 5 minutes of the hour right now, I want to take you to the very last paragraph, item number 98 of this document. After all the rights are identified, which we'll begin to go into tomorrow, the document says, lastly, this is the final point, lastly, because our duty and desire is to do nothing suddenly, which fundamentally concern us, we decree that these rights and liberties shall be audibly read and deliberately weighed at every general court that shall be held within 3 years next ensuing, and such of them as shall not be altered or repealed, they shall stand so ratified that no man shall infringe them without due punishment. After all the rights, privileges, and immunities are identified and expressed, the last thing that they do is to reconfirm that these are so important, they so concern us, that they shall be read, weighed, and affirmed within 3 years every time the general court convenes. In other words, at least every 3 years the general court will reconfirm these rights. They will be read, everybody will know what they are, and such of them that shall not be altered or repealed. So there's a recognition in here that the general court could change some of them. They could add a few, redefine a few, delete a few. These are not fixed. Government has the authority to redefine and update rights and responsibilities. I'm thinking here about the living Constitution and those who would argue that there's no such thing as a living, changing Constitution. These people believed that individual rights and individual rights and responsibilities would change as times changed. That meant that they had to be revisited periodically, reconsidered, and either reconfirmed or altered on a regular basis. And so the last paragraph of this document says, if any general court within these next 3 years shall fail or forget to read and consider them as above said, the governor and deputy governor for the time being and every assistant present at such courts shall forfeit 20 shillings a man, for every deputy 10 shillings a man, for each neglect, which shall be paid out of their proper estate, and not by the country or the towns which should choose them. If members of the General Assembly, the elected officials, fail to do this within 3 years, they are going to pay a fine out of their own personal holdings. This is not going to be a tax that the people pay. This is going to be a personal fine that they pay, proportional to the number of deputies who exist in the assembly. Members of the courts will pay 20 shillings per man. Every deputy will pay 10 shillings per man for every neglect, which shall be paid out of their proper estate, not by the country or the towns which should choose them. And whensoever there shall arise any questions in any court among the assistants and associates thereof about the explanation of these rights and liberties, the general court only shall have the power to interpret them. Government will have the power to revisit them, will have the responsibility to revisit them so that everybody knows their rights and responsibilities. And a failure to do that will result in a fine to every person in there proportional to the number of people and who they are. Think about that as you think about rights and liberties in today's world. It is now 59 minutes after the hour. We have exhausted our time here at the Virtual Center. We'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow will be a 3 o'clock start. We'll run from 3 to 5 tomorrow, and the same on Wednesday. I meant to and neglected to mention that earlier. So we'll be with you an hour earlier tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Bill O'Brien. Be safe. We'll be back together again tomorrow. Thank you.